Well, we have always been saying that it's Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea that are acting together in the war. Russia was using its allies mostly for economic gain and to be able to withstand the sanctions. But right now we see that it's not only North Korean troops, but actually some of the Chinese soldiers who are participating. In the global view, it means that China is not worried of what's going to happen if this is revealed.
The big picture this morning is China and America wrestling for global domination, but zoom in onto Ukraine and you can see some detail. President Zelensky says Ukraine has captured 2 Chinese soldiers fighting for Russia. Are they mercenaries or were they on a mission for China? Beijing isn't saying. Kira Rudik is the leader of Holos, an opposition party in Ukraine. We can speak to her now. Good morning, Kira.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me.
It's a great pleasure. What do you make of this story of Chinese soldiers in the Russian army?
Well, we have always been saying that it's Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea that are acting together in the war. Russia was using its allies mostly for economic gain and to be able to withstand the sanctions. But right now we see that it's not only North Korean troops, but actually some of the Chinese soldiers who are participating. In the global view, it means that China is not worried of what's going to happen if this is revealed, right? So it's either they believe that the United States and Europe would do nothing, or that in this bigger picture of things with the tariffs and everything that's going on, that it will be just yet another step towards the authoritarian regimes against democracies, and they will just get away with it.
Well, because it's an interesting question. We talked about this yesterday, Kira, that as Trump fights China, China becomes a more attractive trading partner for all sorts of countries around Europe, Africa, even Britain. And so the fear is that the world is pushed closer to China, even when it's doing things like fighting in your country.
Definitely China is checking like the limits of what would be acceptable. And this is one of the things. You know, we heard the reports about Chinese soldiers participating for last month, I think. And right now we have like actual proof. But it means that these decisions to send soldiers or to try it out were made like just recently. So after Trump was was elected and came to the office. So it's a good question on if the United States have like a good answer to this. And I don't think so right now. There are so many things going on. But for us in Ukraine, it's yet another proof that authoritarian regimes have been working together and are working together. And the only thing that we as democracies can do is to work together as well and to stay strong and stay united, which is very hard to do when basically US have waged a trade war on everyone.
That's a really good way of putting it. Where are we when it comes to peace, Kira? Because lots of talk about ceasefires, lots of self-promotion coming out of the American camp. This feels like the war isn't going anywhere.
Well, the war is not going anywhere. It continues in a very active and drastic way. Recently, Russian attacks on peaceful cities have increased, killing children on the playground in the city of Kryvyi Rih and having a massive attack on Kyiv, where I am right now. So we have seen that Donald Trump, no matter that he said that he will end the war, he was not even able to get Russia onto having the same press conference as the United States after the negotiations in Riyadh. They basically have given 2 different statements about what they have agreed on. And so there is no ceasefire. Our cities are under attack. Russia keeps attacking us at the battlefield on the front line. And it seems that the United States don't have the plan B on what to do. And we have told everyone that this is exactly how is it going to be with Russia, because we have been in this so-called ceasefire negotiations with them since 2014. There has been more than 200 rounds of those negotiations for us, and they never, ever worked. So the question is, President Trump said that he has some cards with Russia. I think it's time right now to show those cards because he doesn't look very good right now.
Kira, it's an interesting point to see whether he will do anything further.
Now, Ukrainian forces say they've captured 2 Chinese nationals who were fighting for the Russian army in eastern Ukraine's Donetsk region. President Zelensky said intelligence suggested the number of Chinese soldiers in the Russian army was much higher than 2, but there's been no immediate response to the claims from either Moscow or Beijing. Let's talk to Cedric Layton, who's a former US colonel and member of the Joint Staff for the Pentagon, now CNN's military analyst of this. 2 Chinese nationals fighting for the Russian army. This is the first time we've seen this, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And it's really interesting because if it were a very well organized effort, the Chinese would be very careful not to reveal themselves, not to be so close to the front lines that they would potentially be captured. And now with this situation, it kind of begs a few questions. One of them, are these people volunteers that came on their own to fight in the Russian army? Or are they mercenaries, part of a more organized group? Is there a Chinese version of the Wagner group that we don't know about? Or is this something that is sanctioned by the People's Liberation Army so that their soldiers get some practice in combat operations? These are all possibilities. I think in President Zelensky's posting on X, it was pretty clear that he wanted to be very careful not to accuse the Chinese government of being involved in this directly, but it will be very interesting to see what the interrogations reveal if we ever get to see those kinds of notes there from those kinds of questioning sessions.
Because China has been providing some support for Russia, hasn't it, in terms of military supplies? But clearly, until now at least, there's been no evidence of China actually providing any kind of military personnel or soldiers.
That's correct, Carol, absolutely. And one of the things the Chinese have done publicly, at least, is they've distanced themselves a bit from Vladimir Putin's war efforts in Ukraine. Now, they obviously support those efforts. They, have a very close relationship, practically an alliance, but they don't go as far as the North Koreans, who openly sent soldiers into the along with the Russian army into the Kursk region. But I think it was very interesting to note the difference that President Zelensky of Ukraine made when he talked about the North Korean and Chinese situations. The North Koreans stayed in Russia proper, whereas the Chinese were captured on internationally recognized Ukrainian soil. So this is a very interesting development, just from that standpoint as well.
We have seen, a significant contingent of North Koreans fighting alongside the Russians. But does it look as though these could just be mercenaries or individuals who've gone to fight with Russia, just as we know that there are some British personnel who are fighting alongside Ukrainian troops?
Yes, absolutely. And it's certainly a distinct possibility. That's why we have to be very careful when this is assessed to determine whether or not, there's a direct tie to the Chinese government, or did these individuals act independently? And both are possible scenarios in this case. It seems to me, just looking at the video that President Zelensky posted of the one Chinese national, it seems that he was not a very experienced military person, and this is obviously just a few seconds worth of video, but it does seem as if he was not quite a professional soldier. So that could mean that he just opted to leave his region of China and come to fight for the Russians. There are certainly pockets of China that are experiencing poverty, and that might be a way out for some of them, but it is it is definitely something where you have to take a look and see, whether or not there are certain connections with the Chinese government, or if there are none, and that, of course, would result in different responses in this situation.
Finally, and just briefly, although it's a big question, Cedric, we were hearing so much about the efforts to negotiate some kind of a ceasefire as part of President Trump's pledge to bring the war to an end. Clearly, the president is somewhat preoccupied with his trade wars just at the moment. But is there any sign that that process is going anywhere?
Not really, Carol, and I'm sad to say that because Ukraine certainly deserves peace in this situation, but none of the diplomatic movements that have been heralded have borne any fruit. And when you look at what's happening on the ground, especially what the Russians are doing, it's very clear that President Putin of Russia does not want to embark on any type of ceasefire deal or any type of long-term peace proposal. So that's I think something that means that this is going to be a war that continues for a while until attention is brought back on that diplomatic process.
Cedric Leighton, a former US colonel, member of the Joint Staff of the Pentagon, now CNN's military analyst.